contrasting ideas, although, despite, right? So it's really although, even though, and though. Though, although, even though, same thing. And despite and in spite of, same thing. So this is based off of the dinner party conversations that you saw in the previous video. And there's Jack and Diane, Gina and Max, and Randy and Melissa. Or let's put the ladies first. There's Diane and Jack, and Gina and Max, and Melissa and Randy. Here's Jack saying, although I got a pay raise with the promotion at work, all the costs of the new apartment have made it so that we have less savings every month. Right, so make more money, no savings. Right? Kind of a contrasting idea. Diane says, right, this new apartment is much more expensive than the last one. Despite the higher cost, both Jack and I are very happy with the decision. The apartment's very expensive, but very happy with the decision. Right? Contrast. And despite something, right? Despite the cost, despite a thing. The next part here, Max says, right, despite the Uber ride being easier for us, Gina thought it would be better to drive our own car, right? So the Uber ride, easy, and then Gina said, no, let's take the car. So Uber, easy, car, a little bit more complicated. And Gina here says, even though driving here complicates some things, it gives us the possibility of leaving the party whenever we want. Now, she's right. She could go home at 2 in the morning. She could go home at 4 in the morning. Not a problem. She could go home whenever she wants with the car. So flexibility with a car, but complications because they can't be drinking when they're driving, and they have to find parking. Lots of complications. Melissa says, in spite of never having met him before, I know that Max will become a really good friend. Gina and Max are a really nice couple. So she doesn't know him too well, right? She doesn't know him, but she's optimistic because Gina's cool, the friends are cool, so doesn't know anything, but she's sure of something, right? That's the contrast. So lots of things, in spite of, and despite, a little bit trickier than although and though and even though, but it's still pretty easy. You just have to think about it a little bit. We'll take a look at lots of examples and we'll do some practice. So number one, let's take a look at although and though and even though. The contrast words although, though, even though are conjunctions that combine two opposite sentences, right? So like a positive and a negative, some contrasting idea. And they can also be used to start a sentence, right? They're similar to each other. So we could use these at the beginning of the sentence. We could also use them in the middle of the sentence because we can move those sentences around. We can move one clause, move it under, the clause from under, we can move it on top. We could change the position, right? So I could say, even though the weather was not very good, we still had a good time at the picnic. So the weather was not very good, still had a good time. And you can change the position of that, right? We still had a good time at the picnic, even though the weather was not very good. So, although, though, and even though require a clause, right? Pretty much a clause is a sentence or a segment of a sentence. There are independent clauses, which are complete sentences, right? And dependent clauses, like adverbial clauses that require more information. That does not matter what that is. That's just what we call them. So when I say it's a clause, it's like a sentence. Observe. Here's a sentence, here's a clause. Melissa hadn't met Max, right? Great. Got a subject, got a verb. Melissa hadn't met object Max before. And there's my adverbial before and my adverb before. Now, by putting the although in that independent clause, now it becomes a dependent clause. What is that contrast? Although what? Although Melissa hadn't met Max before, right? So now it's asking for another clause. So this is why it's dependent, because now to complete the sentence, you have to add another thing. And you could say although or even though, right? Even though she had never met Max before. So it's just like the same information. She hadn't met Max or she had never met Max, both the same thing. Although, even though, the same thing. She, Melissa, same thing. Once again, here are the examples. I could change the position of them, right? Although Melissa hadn't met Max before, she knew that he would be a good guy. See, there's a full sentence now. Or Melissa knew that Max would be a good guy, although she had never met him before. Right, I'll slow it down. Although Melissa hadn't met Max before, she knew that he would be a good guy. Or Melissa knew that Max would be a good guy, although she had never met him before. Another example, though the host had an extra bag of ice ready. Once again, now that's dependent because of that. Though it's asking for something else. Though the host had an extra bag of ice ready. Although they prepared an extra bag of ice. Lots of ways to say the same information. Although or though, subject verb, right? Though the host had an extra bag of ice ready, it was not necessary to open it and use it. Right? Or, it was not necessary to open and use the extra bag of ice, though the hosts had it ready. Though an Uber ride would be easy, right? Even though it would be easy to take an Uber, same thing. Though and even though, I could put the subject an Uber ride, or I could put it, an Uber ride, same thing. Would be easy, would be, same verb. Even though it would be easy to take an Uber, Gina decided it would be better to drive there. Or, Gina decided it would be better to drive to the party, even though it would have been easy to take an Uber. Yeah. So these get long, right? It's remember, you have one idea and another idea. So that's why these get longer, because you have two ideas together. Overview of despite and in spite of. We also use these contrast words to express a thing that is unexpected or opposite of a main idea. They're used with a noun clause, or a gerund. What? So despite a thing, or despite an idea. So I could say, despite the bad weather is a thing. Today we have good weather, thank God. Despite the bad weather, despite the weather being bad. There's the trick, is the gerund, right? So I want you guys to get really good at gerunds, because we use them a lot in English. And I know that for some Spanish speakers, this is very difficult because we don't use that in Spanish. Let's investigate, right? So despite the bad weather, despite the weather being bad, we still had a good time. So the bad weather or the weather being bad, still had a good time, right? And that in spite of, this is the exact same thing. Despite or in spite of. Right? In spite of the bad weather, we still had a good time at the picnic, or in spite of the weather being bad, we still had a good time at the picnic. So despite and in spite of require a thing. Right? They require a gerund. We talked about gerunds before. We talked about how the ing is the idea of a thing, right? Like, I teach, teaching, right? I like teaching. Teaching is fun, right? Teaching is cool. Talking in front of the camera, ugh, do not like it. It's not for me, but I have to, right? Maybe that's why I didn't make videos for a long time, because I don't like making videos. Making videos is a lot of work. In this case, the weather being bad is the gerund. And once again, that in spite of, requires a thing, it requires a noun, like in spite of the bad weather, or in spite of the weather being bad. Despite not having met Max before. Right. Now that gerund is a little big, but you could do this, right? It's having met or not having met. And then I just add some extra information. Don't worry about it too much. Practice with me, say it with me. Despite not having met Max before, Melissa, Or I could also do the though. Maybe it's a little bit easier. You decide how to say it. Both sentences say the same thing. Though she hadn't met Max before. Even though she hadn't met Max before. Although she hadn't met Max before. All that's the same. And with that though, although, even though, remember, it's a sentence. Subject verb. She hadn't met Max. Another example, right? In spite of her never having met Max. Right? In spite of her never having met Max. The gerund here, you need that possessive for some gerunds. I'll get into this with gerunds when we talk about it. But right now we're just observing. I could also say in spite of never having met Max. That clause needs a little something. I need to define like who am I talking about? Who never met Max? Me? You? Her? In this case, we're talking about Melissa. So in spite of Melissa never having met Max, in spite of her never having met Max, both of those specify who we're talking about, even though she had never met Max. And you could also add the fact that, in spite of the fact that. And now that the fact is a thing. Despite the fact that, now you can add a clause. Despite the host having an extra bag. In spite of the fact that the host had an extra bag of ice ready, it was not necessary to open it and use it. Or, it was not necessary to open and use the extra bag of ice in spite of the fact that the host had it ready. Big sentences. Once again, you could add the fact that, right, plus a clause. Right? In spite of the fact that it would be easy versus the gerund, despite it being easy to take an Uber, right? To be easy, then I have to put the ing for the gerund, being easy. In spite of the fact that it would be easy to take an Uber, Gina decided it would be better to drive there. Or, Gina decided it would be better to drive to the party, despite it being easy to take an Uber. Let's simplify. Right? I think we need that. So let's take a look at contrast, right? So we had a good time, the weather was bad. Two contrasting ideas. Although the weather was bad, or despite the weather being bad, although the weather was bad, we still had a good time. And I'm using still as an emphasis. Another example, it would be easy to take an Uber, and Gina decided it would be better to drive there. Gina decided it would be better to drive to the party, although it would be easy to take an Uber. Or I could also put it in the past. It would have been easy with that mode. Perfect. Although it would have been easy to take an Uber. And Gina decided it would be better to drive to the party, despite it being easy to take an Uber. So this is from the previous video. These are ways that people greet each other. Maybe it's a hug, or you bow, or maybe it's a kiss on the cheek, right? Or you're shaking hands, or maybe you're just waving hello, you're waving goodbye. It depends on your culture, it depends on the relationship. In the United States, people greet each other warmly. Although they rarely kiss on the cheek, they don't kiss on the cheek much in the US. They often give big hugs, right? Me and my friends, we would give hugs. I'm not kissing people on the cheek. I could change the position of that, right? In the United States, people greet each other warmly. They often give big hugs, although they rarely kiss each other on the cheek. Another example, in the United States, people greet each other warmly despite not kissing each other on the cheek. They don't kiss on the cheek. Despite not kissing each other on the cheek, they are still very friendly. Change the position. In the United States, people greet each other warmly. They are still very friendly, right? There's that still very friendly for emphasis, still very friendly, despite not kissing each other on the cheek. So let's practice expressing contrast, right? Here you have, even though Kyle likes sci-fi movies, not like movie last night. So what could that be? Think about it a little bit. Take some time. Okay. Here's my solution. Here's my example. Once again, I just added it to make it a more complete sentence. I added things to it to make it a more complete sentence. Even though Kyle really likes sci-fi movies, he didn't like the movie from last night. Even though Kyle really likes sci-fi movies, he didn't like the movie from last night. Same thing here, but now we're going to use despite. Right, so despite Kyle likes sci-fi movies, hello, Mr. Butterfly. Excuse me. So despite Kyle likes sci-fi movies, not like movie last night. You got to think about it a little bit. I'll let you think. Maybe you could write it down, write it on a piece of paper, or write it on your computer. Despite Kyle really liking sci-fi movies, he didn't like the movie from last night. So I could do it this way. Despite Kyle really liking sci-fi movies, that a subject plus the gerund, that's fine. It helps me specify who I'm talking about. Kyle liking sci-fi movies. That's how we build the gerund on that one. So despite that, he didn't like the movie from last night. Okay, and I could change it around. I don't need that subject, right? But I could put that subject in later because that information goes together. So notice how the name Kyle is still in there. So I could say despite Kyle really liking sci-fi movies, or I could say despite really liking sci-fi movies, Kyle didn't like the movie from last night. Because I have to specify who am I talking about, right? Do I really like sci-fi movies? I do. Do you really like sci-fi movies? I don't know if you do or not. Who are we talking about? Kyle. So despite Kyle really liking sci-fi movies, or despite really liking sci-fi movies, Kyle, Despite plus Kimberly plus day off from work plus need to study. So, right? Day off from work, yay, no responsibility with work, but, need to study. Or maybe need to study. Studying is a good thing. Please study. Okay. I'm going to let you think about it for a second. For a few seconds here. Right. Despite Kimberly having a day off from work, she needed to study and couldn't relax. Right. So I could say, despite Kimberly having a day off from work, she had a day off from work, she couldn't relax, she needed to study. Right. Contrasting ideas. So I could say also, despite having a day off from work, Kimberly needed to study and couldn't relax. I need to introduce that subject in there. Who am I talking about? And one way to do that, once again, is subject gerund, right? Kimberly having a day off from work. Same thing, but with although, right? Although plus Kimberly plus day off from work plus need to study. So I don't know if this is easier for you. It's easier for a lot of students to do with although instead of despite, but we got to practice those gerunds. It's super important. That's why we're looking at it now. Think about it. All right, here's my example. Although Kimberly had a day off from work, she needed to study and couldn't watch TV all day. Remember, Kimberly had, that's my subject and my verb. Kimberly had a day off from work. All right, here's one, right? Though plus some people plus make a lot of money plus not know how to save, right? Some people, they make a lot of money, but they spend a lot of money, right? Maybe that's a necessity. I'll let you think about this. Okay, Though some people make a lot of money, a lot of them don't know how to save, right? And that's a truism that you really have to learn how to not spend so much. That's why I make these classes so affordable, right? Because I want everyone to practice. Tell your friends. Though some people make a lot of money, a lot of them don't know how to save, right? In spite of, plus some people, plus make a lot of money, plus not know how to save. So now we're going to use in spite of. Think about it a little bit. In spite of. I put down two ways to save, right? So here, these two examples, I put, in spite of making a lot of money, some people don't know how to save. So my subject is down in that second clause, right? In spite of making a lot of money, some people don't know how to save. Or I could say it, right? In spite of some people making a lot of money, a lot of them don't know how to save. Same information, reads clearly. You really got to practice this stuff in class, you and I. In spite of, plus Mackenzie, plus plenty of things to do at home, plus be bored. Be bored, right? Yeah, she has everything at the house, still bored. Let you think about that for a minute. Here's what I put down. I put two down, put two examples down. The first one is in spite of the fact that. Now, the fact is the noun. So good. And then a noun plus the rest of the clause. Mackenzie had plenty of things to do at home. Reads like this. In spite of the fact that Mackenzie had plenty of things to do at home, she was still incredibly bored. I'll read that again. In spite of the fact that Mackenzie had plenty of things to do at home, she was still incredibly bored. The second one. In spite of Mackenzie having plenty of things to do at home, she was still incredibly bored. There's that still. That still is the emphasis, right? Still incredibly bored. I'll read that again. In spite of Mackenzie having plenty of things to do at home, she was still incredibly bored. This time we're going to use even though. Even though should be easy. Even though plus Mackenzie plus plenty of things to do at home plus be bored. Think about it for a second. Here's my example. Even though Mackenzie had plenty of things to do at home, she was still incredibly bored. Thanks for watching. Look at these examples. We'll do the stuff together in class. Have a great day.